G'day guys, how are we going? Well, I recently got a video request from a guy asking if I could do a video covering all the performance upgrades that I've done on my GU Patrol over the years. So I thought, yep, righto. So we'll cover engine mods, gearbox and transfer case, diff ratios, wheels, tyres and hubs, and the gauges that I've got inside. Let's get into it. So we'll start under the bonnet under here. So how did I go about getting more engine performance out of my mighty ZD30? Well, I think it was back about in 2019. I used to have just a power chip on it, which, yeah, wasn't too bad. But we replaced that. The chip came out and then we replaced it with a performance tune, all done through the ECU on the dyno, that sort of thing. And then couple that up with the turbo upgrade as well that I've done. I've done a stage 2 turbo upgrade, so slightly bigger turbo from standard. And, you know, and just driving it now for what it is, you know, talking about a 3-ton vehicle with this engine in it, for what it is, it's just such a nice vehicle to drive, you know, when you couple the tune up with the turbo upgrade as well. You know, overtaking now is just a piece of cake, you know, back into fourth and, you know, when I overtake something and just into it. And it just works an absolute treat when you couple those couple of things together. And then up the top up here, you know, I've got the bigger intercooler going on there as well, with the thermo fan underneath it. Now the intercooler is a great upgrade for, you know, helping keep things cooler, and especially with the turbo, keep the cooler air going through the turbo. All that helps with the performance. But the thing with the thermo fan underneath it, where that's a great addition to have the thermo fan going on, because, you know, the only time really an intercooler working, if you don't have the fan underneath it like I've got here, the only time the intercooler is really doing its job is when you're cruising down the highway, it's sort of an 100k odd an hour. You know, you got all the wind that's blasting through the scoop up there, down in the intercooler, and then it's doing its job. But when you're out, you know, doing low range work, you know, out in, say, the Vic High Country, wherever, and, you know, you're only maybe cruising along at, you know, tricking along at 5, 10, 15k an hour sort of tops in some of those steep country, well, the intercooler's absolutely doing nothing because there's no airflow coming through the scoop there to do the job that it's designed to go and do. So that's where the fan is really important addition to have with the intercooler. And the fan, well, that's temperature controlled as well. So that'll switch on when the EGT gauge, which is, I'll show you that a bit later on the pillar pod inside. When the EGT temps get to 200 degrees plus, well, that fan will automatically kick in and it'll run while it's above 200 degrees when I'm driving along, whether it be up the highway or, you know, or cruising through the big tracks of the Vic High Country. While it's over 200 degrees, that fan is working to do the job that there's no airflow coming through if I'm doing those low speed ranges. But the thing is also too, it won't turn off until that temperature drops below 200 degrees. Again, I can monitor that from my gauge inside on the pillar pod. So, you know, the thermo fan is a really, you know, really handy thing to have, you know, to keep that intercooler doing the job it's meant to do, especially in those low range crawling, you know, full drive stuff that I do out in the Vic High Country. Yeah, and just something else I've also done to help, you know, the engine breathe properly and get those exhaust gases out the back out there as quickly as possible. I've also got a 3-inch exhaust, which that's connected up to the back of the turbo there. So from the turbo all the way through is 3-inch exhaust. I think they come out standard, the Patrol, with something like 2-inch exhaust. So just makes it breathe a lot better. And then also the head, as I've mentioned before, you know, the head's been done twice now in 16 years that I've had this Patrol from new. First time it failed at around 300 odd thousand Ks, and, you know, we did put a new head and everything on it there. The head gasket, the whole lot was all done back then. But it did fail again. It was sort of close to 400 odd thousand Ks, or maybe just a bit over. But the only time then we still used the same head. Everything was all tested and all came back fine. But just the gasket was replaced second time round. But we've all used all genuine Nissan parts with the replacement with the second time round. But, you know, but it's now got, you know, over 440,000 Ks on the clock. You know, for a ZD30, it's pretty good, amazing Ks really, because considering, you know, for the reputation that these things have, you know, where they're supposed to blow up at 100,000 Ks. But, you know, severely good maintenance with this has gone a long way, and, you know, I've had it from day one, so I know it really well. You know, do all my regular oil changes and those sort of things every sort of 5,000 k's, oil and filter, and I do all those myself at home. But in the day, it's fitting. It's just a great thing, you know. And just getting back to what I was talking about before with that thermo fan that's underneath the intercooler there, how I mentioned, you know, it won't turn off until the engine temperature drops below 200 degrees. Well, if I go on a trip or anything, I don't switch the engine off until I watch that gauge in there, which I'll show you a bit later on, but I watch that pillar pod gauge in there, the EGT temps, and I'll leave this engine running until that drops below 200 degrees. And as soon as it drops below 200 degrees, that's when the fan turns off as well. But, you know, you do hear of people, they do have what's called turbo timers, connected up to their motors, but I'm not a big fan of turbo timers, especially with a manual vehicle, because the idea of a turbo timer is you can turn the key off, but the engine keeps on running. But you walk away, and depending on what time you've got set on your turbo timer, whether it's a minute or two, well, the engine keeps running for that time you've got set on your turbo timer, but you walk away, and the only thing then holding you full driving wherever you park it is the handbrake. So it's not an ideal situation to be in, but you know, automatic's probably a little bit different. At least you can put the handbrake on and then put it in park as well. But I don't know, I'm just not a big fan of turbo timers. So I'm the human turbo timer, and I've done that pretty much from day one with this vehicle. I won't turn it off until, you know, it cools down. Give it a good few minutes. But since I've had the pillar pod there, it makes it a lot easier now to monitor that temperature before I go switching it off, and also waiting for that fan to turn off as well to go along with it. So now we're going to have a chat about the gearbox and transfer case. There's a little bit going on there, especially in the transfer case. Let's have a yarn about that. Righto, so gearbox and transfer case. We'll start with the gearbox. Gearbox is still all original, so all the gear ratios in the gearbox are still all original. Never changed any of those, and to this day the gearbox has never been opened. Do regular oil change and everything on that, which certainly a good idea. Still running standard clutch. Don't do anything fancy with the clutch. Everything's just sort of a standard clutch. I think I'm about third or maybe fourth clutch from new. But where the big changes have gone on is inside the transfer case. Now, I've put a 42% reduction gearing within the transfer case. So what goes on there is the original cluster of gear ratios is when you're doing all your low range full drive work, it changes that ratio. So what goes on there, the standard cluster gets pulled out of the transfer case, and a bigger gear cluster goes in to replace that. I think there's even a little bit of machining's got to go on inside the transfer case to fit the bigger gearing in, the bigger size cogs that go in it, and fitting them. You know, how good is the gear ratios now in you know, for low range and that sort of thing. When you're talking reduction gears, they are just an amazing bit of kit. My first gear before is about equivalent to my second gear now, and first gear before wasn't still too bad. It would run away just a little bit going down hills, but first gear now is just finicky. It's insane how low it is. There's pretty much not many steep downhill tracks I'm doing anywhere in the high country, you know, your billy goats and all those sort of things, where I'm going down and I'm generally accelerating, feathering the accelerator to keep things going. Very rarely ever do I have to touch brakes in that first gear range. It's just insane how low it is. And then same going up, you know, it's ideal for, you know, those low range crawling, you know, steep tracks again. First gear is just insane. But yeah, first, second gear, and I can even do some of those, you know, steeper stuff, you know, in second gear, and sometimes even into third, depending how steep it really is. But first gear is just next level. It's amazing. So yeah, reduction gears, well worth it if you want to go down that road, depending on what style of full drive you know you're doing, as to whether you really need them or not. You know, and just to add to, you know, having those reduction gears in, as I mentioned, you know, driving down the steep hills, particularly in first gear, low range, very rarely do I ever have to touch the brakes. So it's a great position to be in, because the last thing you want to do is be using your brakes as, you know, you want to use them as little as possible to stay off the brakes. So you don't want overheat those brakes. Then you get brake fade. Then you got all sorts of trouble if you get brake fade and going down a steep hill and you lose your brakes. It's not a great position to be in. So that reduction gears, they make a world of difference for that sort of thing as a safety point of view, to be able to stay off those brakes. They're fair income wicked. So the front and rear diffs in my GU Patrol, well, solid axles, front and rear. You know, it's a combination you don't see a lot about these days with this sort of diff format coming out these days. A lot of them are independent front and rears, or even just independent fronts. Now where, you know, coil suspension all round, solid axles. It's a pretty damn good combination, you know, straight off the showroom floor. You know, this sort of running gear is pretty much bulletproof unless you really do some serious hardcore damage to them, but you very rarely break this sort of running gear. You know, there's a reason why comp trucks, a lot of comp trucks, you know, they run the GQ and GU diffs and those sort of things, just purely because they are so reliable and such a strong unit. Still running standard ratios in the front and rear diffs, haven't had the need to change those, even though I'm running a slightly bigger tyre. I'm running a 33-inch tyre. So it's a little bit slightly bigger tyre from standard. And also I'm running front and rear air lockers. You know, when you couple that up with, you know, front and rear lockers, you know, the transfer case, you know, the low range gearing in the transfer case, the reduction gears and some low tyre pressures going on there, it makes this rig a pretty capable rig, especially well built and well designed for doing a lot of those high country tracks. Right, so let's have a chat about wheels, tyres and hubs on my GU Patrol. So we'll start with the tyres, as I mentioned. 33-inch tyre to the 285/75 with a 16-inch rim. Now, when my Patrol came out as of standard, they came out with a 17-inch wheel on them. I pretty much, almost from day one, went back to a 16-inch wheel. And why did I go about doing that? Well, one, to get a bigger sidewall. Going back to 16-inch, especially when, you know, you go let your tyre pressures down. There's a lot more rubber there on the bottom down there for, you know, when you let your tyre pressures down. And then also with the 16-inch, you've got to make sure, one thing I had to do, make sure was that they were going to fit, you know, especially with the brake calipers going from a 17-inch back to a 16-inch. And they certainly do. And then the hubs in here, you know, I've changed the hubs over, gone from just the standard auto locking hubs that I had, you know, a few years ago, but you know, they were, you know, they worked great there for a number of years. But I've now gone to these, and these have been great. These have been on there, oh, how long have they been on there for? Probably, I don't know, 8, maybe 9 years or something like that out of the 16 years that I've had it. You know, old school stuff. You know, you've actually got to get out and lock these things in. You know, there's no electrical buttons inside, you know, to engage full drive. You got to get out and actually you know, click them in. And I just like that sound. You know, click them in. It's great. So that sort of covers wheels, tyres and hubs, and let's move on and see what else we've got. Righto, so in here I've got a couple of pretty important gauges going on here to monitor my ZD30 while I'm driving around and that sort of thing. So in the bottom gauge down in here is my oil pressure gauge, which, you know, really important gauge to have. Rather than just relying on the standard, you know, light that comes on in the dash down in there. You know, I think sometimes unless you got a you know, a designated oil pressure gauge, just rely on that light that's in your dash. Sometimes by the time that light comes on, it can be too late. So it's good to see exactly what's going on all the time, you know, with the oil pressure and that sort of thing. And then also with the oil pressure, I also like to warm my vehicle up, you know, warm the Patrol up before going for a drive, especially during winter. You know, rather than taking off too soon, because, you know, that oil pressure is pretty high when you first start the engine up, because the oil's cold and it's thick. So, you know, you go driving off and you're trying to force that, you know, cold, thick oil through the system, can put a bit of pressure on it. So I like to warm it up. I like to let that oil pressure drop down a little bit, just so, you know, there's a bit of temperature in the oil and it's flowing around the engine, you know, a lot smoother. And when it heats up, well, the oil thins out and goes around the engine, certainly a lot better than what it does if you just start it up and drive off and put your foot into it and give it a hard time. So probably not ideal, but yeah, that gauge is great down there, the oil pressure. And then the top one up here, got a twin readout going on here. So I've got my EGT readout gauge and my turbo boost pressure gauge going on in these two here. And again, EGTs, you know, it's a vital gauge. I reckon it almost should nearly be standard, I reckon, the EGT gauge. But, you know, if you've not had an EGT gauge before, and go and fit one in and still drive your vehicle the way how you always have, you might be a bit horrified the numbers that comes out of your EGT gauge if you've never had one before. But, you know, I drive my Patrol by that gauge, you know, whether I'm towing or not, but even more so when I'm towing my camper trailer. You know, I'll watch that gauge, and, you know, and if the EGTs start to climb up too much, you know, I don't like getting above 400, I'd mid 400, especially when I'm towing, I don't. if I'm not towing, it's really hard to get it over 400, but you know, mid 400s, I start watching it, and if you know, I'm going up a hill, with especially the camper on the back, and you know, the EGTs are starting to climb up, well, I'll just go back a gear. If I've got to go up a little bit slower, throw it back into third gear and just cruise up the hill, get over the top, back into fourth, into fifth, and away you go again. But you know, it's just a great way of being able to monitor your engine and being able to look after it too by watching that gauge. And you know, and same with my boost pressure readings, you know, I sort of monitor those as well, you know, especially again when I'm pushing it up hills, and just to see what's going on with those. And then over there, just in the middle there, I've got another twin readout gauge going on in there. So that one there is my battery readouts for my two batteries. So one for my start battery, the A is for my start battery under the bonnet, and then the B readout is for my lithium battery that's down the back, which runs my few accessories that I've got going on there. So there you go, guys. I think I've covered quite a few things here with some of the upgraded mods that I've done on my mighty GU Patrol and that ZD30 over the 16 years that I've had it since new. I hope you've got some value out of it. Let us know if you got some things you want to add to it, or you got any more questions. Chuck them in the comments down below and I'll get back to you. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you on the next one. Hooroo.